Dr. House?
Wilson. Dr. Wilson.
House.
Dr. Wilson.
House.
Wilson's Wilson.
House. House.
Jimmy.
House.
Dr. Wilson. Wilson. James. Wilson. Jimmy Wilson. Wilson's Wilson. Dr. Wilson. 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 Dr. Wilson's
House. Dr. House.
Wilson. Wilson. Wilson.
Dr. Gregory House. House. House.
Wilson.
House.
Jimmy.
House.
Wilson. Wilson.
And the
Wilson.
House.
Wilson's. Wilson's. Dr. Wilson. Dr. James Wilson.
Dr. House.
Wilson.
House.
Wilson. Jimmy.
House. House.
Wilson.
House.
Wilson. Wilson. House. Wilson. Wilson. Dr. Wilson. Wilson.
House.
Wilson's.
General House. 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 House.
Wilson. Wilson. Wilson.
Gregory House.
Wilson.
House.
Wilson. Wilson. Dr. Wilson.
House.
Wilson. Wilson.
House.
Wilson. Wilson.
House. House. House and House. Dr. House.
Wilson.
House.
Wilson's. Wilson's. Wilson. Wilson. Wilson's.
Dr. House.
Wilson. Wilson.
House.
Wilson.
House. House. House.
Wilson. Wilson. Wilson.
House.
Wilson. Wilson's. Wilson.
House. 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 House.
Wilson.
House. House. House.
Dr. Wilson's.
House. House. House.
Wilson's.
House. House.
Wilson. Wilson's. Wilson. Wilson. Wilson's.
House. 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 House.
Wilson.
House.
James Wilson. Wilson's. Wilson. 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 Wilson's. Wilson's. Wilson's.
Dr. House. 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 House.
Wilson.
House.
Dr. Wilson.
House.
Wilson.
House. 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 House.
Wilson.
House. 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 House.
Wilson's.
House. Dr. House. Dr. House.
Dr. Wilson.
House. House. House's house.
Wilson. Wilson.
House. House.
Wilson's. Wilson. 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 Wilson's. Wilson.
House. House.
Wilson. Wilson. Wilson.
House.
Wilson.
House. House.
Wilson. Wilson. Wilson's.
House. House. House.
Wilson. Wilson.
House. House.
Wilson's. Wilson. Wilson.
House. House.
Wilson. 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 Wilson.
House.
Wilson. Wilson.
House. House.
Wilson. Wilson. Wilson's.
House. 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 House.
Wilson's. Wilson. 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 Wilson.
House.
Wilson's.
House. 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 House's house.
Wilson. 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 Wilson.
House. 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 House.
Wilson. 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 Wilson.
House. Gregory House. House. House.
Dr. Wilson.
House.
Wilson.
House.
Wilson.
House. 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 House.
Wilson.
Houses.
Wilson's. Wilson's.
House.
Wilson.
House.
Wilson.
House. House.
Wilson.
House.
Wilson.
House.
Wilson's.
House. House. House.
Black.
House. House.
Wilson's.
Houses. House. 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 Houses.
Wilson.
House. Houses.
Wilson.
House.
Wilson's.
House. House.
Dr. Wilson.
House. House. House.
Dr. Wilson's. Wilson. Dr. James Wilson. Wilson.
House. House.
Jim.
House. House. Houses. Houses. House. House.
Wilson. Wilson.
House.
Wilson.
House.
Wilson's.
House. House. House.
Wilson.
House. House.
Wilson.
House. 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 Gregory House.
Wilson. 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 Wilson's. Wilson. Wilson. Wilson's. Dr. Wilson. Dr. Wilson. Wilson.
House. House.
Wilson.
House. House.
Wilson. Wilson.
House.
Wilson. Wilson.
House. House. House with house.
Wilson. Wilson.
House. House.
Wilson. Wilson's.
House with houses.
James.
House. House.
James. Wilson's. Wilson's.
House. House.
Wilson's.
House.
Wilson.
House. House.
Wilson. 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 Wilson's. Wilson. Wilson's. Wilson's. Wilson. 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 Wilson.
House. House.
Wilson. Wilson is Wilson's.
House. House. House.
Wilson.
House.
Wilson. Wilson. Wilson.
House. House. House.
Wilson. Wilson's.
House. 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 House.
Wilson's. Wilson's.
House.
Wilson.
House. House.
Wilson's.
House. Houses.
Wilson. Wilson's. Wilson.
House.
Wilson.
House. House.
Dr. Wilson. Wilson. Wilson's. Wilson.
House.
Wilson. James Wilson. Wilson.
House.
Wilson.
Dr. House.
Wilson.
House.
Wilson.
House. House. But house.
Wilson. Wilson.
House.
Dr. Gregory House.
House. House. Doctor House. 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 House.
Wilson.
House. 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 House.
Wilson.
House. House.
Wilson.
House. 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 House.
Dr. James Wilson.
House. 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 Doctor House. House.
Wilson's
House. 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 House.
Wilson's James.
House. House. House.
Wilson's
House.
Wilson.
House. 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 House.
Wilson. Wilson.
House. House. House.
Wilson's
House. 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 House.
Wilson's Wilson. Wilson. Wilson.
House.
Dr. James Wilson. 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 Wilson's Wilson.
House.
Wilson.
Gregory House. House.
Wilson. Wilson.
House with
Wilson. Wilson. Wilson.
Gregory House. House.
Wilson.